independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street trees dispute. Thanks for joining us for another session. Could I ask you please to tell us your name and your role?
Yes, certainly. So I'm Lewis Dagnall. I was a Sheffield City Councillor from May 2015 to May 2021, and I was a Cabinet Member responsible for street trees from May 2018 to, I think, August 2019.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks again so much for coming and having the conversation. I really appreciate it. And just a couple of introductory remarks I make with everybody. Firstly, this is being live streamed and being recorded, and we'll publish the recording afterwards, just so that you're aware of that and okay with that. Secondly, the dispute generated quite a lot of upset and tension and anxiety. What we're doing here is creating a forum in which we can have a dispassionate discussion of the issues, but we do need to be careful that we don't inadvertently have anything said which is defamatory or libelous or brings into the public domain information that should be protected under data protection legislation, personal information about individuals, in other words. I'm not expecting us to run into that problem with you, but just for you just to confirm that you understand that and are aware of that.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
So thanks very much. We gave you quite a bit of a list of topics we wanted to discuss, and but I'd also like to give you a chance to make any remarks you'd like to make by way of introduction.
Yes, well, thank you, and thank you to you and all of your team for all your work doing this. I will try and be brief with these opening remarks because, as you say, we do have a lot of questions to get into. I suppose what I wanted to say is it's funny to reflect on this for me, that this is yet another example of something which, had you said 5 years ago that we would be sat here in the town hall conducting a inquiry like this commissioned by the council into what happened here, I don't think people would have believed you. And the change in tone and the change in policy and the change in atmosphere in the city of Sheffield with regards to street trees has been almost unbelievable for people who, people were very pessimistic in 2018 that we could ever begin to resolve the issues, and yet I think the ongoing work, and now we've had a succession of cabinet members beyond me, we've had a succession of council administrations with different parties taking part in the council administrations, and the new approach in which citizens are working with the council to co-produce street tree policy has only deepened. And as I say, I think our session here today and all the sessions you've been doing are also reflective of that.
Well, thank you. I think you made an important point there, and we'll perhaps pick up one or two implications of it. So, just to start, I wonder if you could just tell us first, when you first became aware of opposition to the street trees elements of the Streets Ahead contract, and how the issue was raised in discussions with people living in your ward.
Well, I came to Sheffield in autumn 2011, and so I think about the time I moved to Sheffield, started living in Sheffield and getting involved in local politics with the Labour Party in Sheffield. The Streets Ahead programme was basically agreed, just being tied up and just being begun to be implemented. So I suppose I first became aware of the street trees elements as part of I think we had a presentation at Sheffield Hallam constituency Labour Party, maybe that year, maybe 2012, 2013. I think it was Lee Bramall, who was cabinet member at the time, and I'm sure, the main thrust of that presentation was this is Pothole City and we're going to fix that, and by the way, we'll also fix benches, hedges, trees as we go along. It wasn't in our consciousness at that point that this would become such an issue. I stood for local election in 2014 in Ecclesall ward, which is subsequently been one of the areas, quite strongly affected by this dispute, but at the time, probably because the programme hadn't begun there, I don't recall it being raised at all in that period. And when I stood in 2015 in the Central Ward and got elected in May 2015, that was on the cusp of work beginning in Sharrow. So in the summer of 2015, I did begin to have questions from residents about what's going on. And it was very much on the basis, I've got a letter, I've got some documentation which I'm going to provide to you as well. I've dug out a letter. Now, as I've explained to you previously, I'm no longer a councillor, so most of my correspondence is, I don't know, council's deleted it or whatever. But in my own files, I think I found a letter to residents on Thornset Road discussing what was going on there. And I think in the summer of 2015, the issue that was raised with me was about communication and transparency, and we want to know, along the lines of, we understand stuff has to go on, but we just want to know what it is. I think it was also that summer that the Rustlings road works were publicised, and that started happening, and I expressed concern, within the Labour group at the time, that in the case of Rustlings Road, I felt that was likely to flare up because, as I say, I'd been heavily involved in Hallam Labour Party, into which constituency Rustlings Road falls. I felt that Rustlings Road was likely to flare up because the avenue of trees is alongside Endcliffe Park, and I felt that the connection between the park and that avenue would be felt quite strongly. In response to the petition that eventually went, the council established the Highway Tree Advisory Forums, and so I was quite satisfied that yes, it might have taken the petition coming to full council, but in response to that petition, the council had actually instituted a new way that those people who were concerned about that could engage with that issue. So I thought that was, as with all council issues, there were some people who were interested and concerned, and the council had responded by setting up a forum for them to explore those concerns. So I think in that summer of 2015, I would not, or did, and indeed did not, see it as an exceptional issue outside of the general, panoply of issues the council's engaged in.
Okay, thank you very much. So things then evolved, and I wonder if you could offer us your reflections on the observation of the petitions, public questions and debates at full council after that time. Particularly there was the petition about nether edge trees in February 2016, which was one of the things which led to the judicial review proceedings, and whether you have any observations on how that set of things were sort of handled by the council.
Yes. So I think in the course of that year, the issues began to ramp up. So you had the formation of STAG as a organised, overarching group to coordinate campaigning. Like I say, you had the Highway Tree Advisory Forums, and then in that autumn, the decision was made to launch the independent tree panel process as a further and more serious attempt. And I think that was both motivated by the need to review, the need for, when local councillors, I suppose such as myself, were passing on correspondence to the cabinet member, the need for that to go somewhere. And also, the nature of a street-by-street consultation was that it was felt, again, that although there were increasing numbers of people coming to full council and asking public questions, it wasn't necessarily out of the normal range of people who might be interested in a given issue. And I think, and this was perhaps borne out by the ITP balance, it was felt that actually the opinion on the given streets would be much more divided than the presentation that was brought to the council. I can't, this isn't my view necessarily, but I think that there was a view, people were, aggrieved that some of these mega petitions had signatures on Change UK from across the UK and the states and stuff like this. And there was some concern, I think, when people do a parliamentary petition on the UK government website, you have to fill in your postcode and you have to verify that you're a resident and an elector. Whereas with the petitions that were being brought to full council, they were Change UK petitions that anybody could sign. And as I say, I can't say it particularly bothered me, but I know that colleagues on the council were concerned that this issue was the scale of concern about this issue at that time was being distorted by people who were not directly affected. And so the ITP had been an attempt to gauge the views of those who were not signing petitions and those who were directly affected by tree work or the contrary, the lack of tree work and the problems caused by that. I don't think I've got anything to add about the Never Edge Trees petition in particular.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I don't think I took part in that debate. As I say, I mean, my ward bordered on Never Edge, but was more properly Sharrow, and I don't believe that the Never Edge Trees issue, I think that was concerned with the other end of Never Edge, so I might have been more involved had it been within my ward.
Yes.
Yes. But at the time, it was a petition about a local area in the general run of having petitions about local areas.
Yes. Okay. I wonder if you remember anything about how the outcome of the judicial review in 2016 was viewed by the council. If you remember any discussions with your colleagues about that.
Well, the decision by the High Court to pause the tree work while they considered the JR application I think that was quite a shock. And those who support, those campaigners who supported the JR application were quite delighted. It was February 2016 that they began their application and it was paused, and they were quite delighted. They felt that the decision by the High Court to pause for policy implementation was a victory. And I suppose this is one occasion on which I might say this several times today, but the point of our local democracy is that we elect our peers, lay people, to take decisions in our best interests. Mm-hmm. And so we as councillors were, I guess, to some degree, a bit mystified by this decision, and we had we had this explained to us by the cabinet member at Labour Group. We were asking the Labour Group, why has this happened? What are the implications? Have they paused this because our policy is wrong? Have they, is this normal to pause it? I think the view was it was unusual to pause it. And so then 2 months later, when the High Court judgment came out, it was quite a watershed, because the language in that judgment was quite stark.
Yes.
it said that as we all know, it said that the case that had been put was devoid of merit, and it emphasised a point which I have often reflected on, which is, there are disagreements in a liberal democracy which are reasonable disagreements, and the High Court at that point said that on the basis of the evidence given to them, this was a reasonable disagreement in which the councillors were entitled to disagree with residents.
Right.
And so I think, as I say, after the shock of the pause and people saying that the pause represented a victory, the then starkness of the outcome of that JR, I suppose it was reassuring to councillors that it reasserted our role. It was our responsibility to decide upon policy, mindful of the public, but we were also entitled to make decisions which might be disagreed with by a minority of the public.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to come on to other sort of bits of the chronology. I just want, though, to ask you a sort of broader question,
yes, please.
Which is, if you could describe to us how, insofar as you understood it, because you weren't a cabinet member at this point, decision-making functioned among sort of different groups in the council at that time. Really, we'll come on to the period when you became a cabinet member later, but could you just give us a bit of a description of how decision-making worked? There were the councillors, there were the officers, and
Yeah, well, I mean, and at the time we had the 10 cabinet members. For us as Labour group members, each year we elected a leader and a deputy leader, and a set of officers of our group who would then liaise between the leader would appoint the cabinet. Group officers of our Labour group would arrange for those cabinet members to attend Labour group and give us updates.
Right.
And the council would facilitate, as it does to all political groups, the council would also sort of lend us officers to come to briefing sessions before Labour group, so we could then have informed debates. Ultimately, it was the cabinet making the decisions at cabinet on the basis of the reports presented to them, but we as Labour group decided upon the policy direction. And so we also had a role. We had both the scrutiny, the formal scrutiny functions on council, where it was our responsibility to scrutinise cabinet policy, and we had our opportunity as Labour councillors to scrutinise whether Labour cabinet members were putting Labour policy into practice. And so, my understanding was, policy was driven by the cabinet, but we had discussions to collectively agree the course of policy, and on big decisions we were consulted about whether that big decision was in line with Labour group policy.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the big decisions that was taken was what to do in Roslings Road, and obviously, everyone knows what happened there in November 2016. I wanted just to ask if you had any views on what happened, but also if you could tell us about discussions you were involved with in the aftermath of that, including discussions I understand took place in the Labour group. Yes,
I suppose it's worth. So I suppose in terms of Labour group decision making, the sort of the mechanics of how Ruslings Road transpired were seen as the preserve of that was up to the cabinet member and the officers,
right,
to work out the day to day. The big decision was, are we going ahead with the Streets Ahead programme?
Yes.
Or not? The cabinet member would go and implement it, and then we would scrutinise their implementation. So, we didn't make a decision as a Labour group to handle Ruslings Road in the way that it was handled.
Right.
That was the decision taken by the cabinet member, and we had quite a robust Labour group meeting following that to debate the merits of the approach that had been taken.
Okay. And the decision, as you just said, had been taken by the Cabinet member, Councillor Lodge, at that time.
Yes.
And you had then a discussion in the Labour group. I don't know if you can tell us about, I mean, you say it was robust. I wonder if you could tell us about the kind of issues or questions that were raised and who was sort of responding.
Well, for example, I suppose I feel only able to speak for myself, so I was very interested in knowing, so I was, I had the opportunity at Labour Group to ask questions of Councillor Lodge in a confidential setting as Labour councillor colleagues, and I was interested in who had signed it off, whether it was the decision of a Cabinet member, whether it was a decision of officers, who had decided that the police would get involved, whether the furore had been anticipated or whether the entire exercise had been expected to go off without a hitch, basically. I wasn't totally satisfied at the time with the explanation. I do think, in terms of the subsequent local government ombudsman findings about the Rustling Road issue, the fact that the council has subsequently apologised formally, the police have apologised formally for their role in Rustlings Road, I do think that my concerns have been vindicated.
Okay.
That it was an ill-conceived way of going about it.
Right.
I think that to give, well, I mean, it's up to others to explain their thinking, because as I say, I don't feel I got to the bottom of what their thinking was. I think, though, a concern throughout was, how do we implement this policy without members of the public getting hurt and without people working for the council or working on behalf of the council getting hurt? And so I think when they planned that operation, they believed that by doing it early in the morning, they would avoid crowds forming and they would minimise the risk to the public and minimise the risk to the workers. That was ill-conceived because crowds did form, and the effect on trust and dialogue, having established the tree forums, the ITP process, having established all that and tried to create fora in which public could engage, it was seen as a dirty move by the members of the public. And I think that was perhaps one of the first shockwaves that definitely went wider than those concerned about trees. People were concerned about the seeming well, it looked like the council was trying to hide what it was doing, and as I've explained, I believe, or I understand their intention was to protect by doing it early in the morning, but I think it looked like it was trying to be hidden early in the morning.
I see. I understand. Is there Well, I was going to ask you. I mean, you've talked about you've alluded to the effect of what happened in Rustlings Road more widely, but I wondered if there's anything else you wanted to say about that. People saw what happened and they reacted in a certain way. I don't know if anything struck you about that.
Well, I have something to say which is my opinion, and make this what you will. I mean, I felt the behaviour of the local MP was disproportionate. So the local MP at the time was Nick Clegg, who had, until a year before, been the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And so when Nick Clegg said that this was something out of Putin's Russia, I, sincerely found that, and, especially now, find that to be quite an abhorrently disproportionate comment. At the time, when I had discussions with people, I did point out, in Putin's Russia, opposition politicians get shot or poisoned for speaking out. Nick Clegg had been Deputy Prime Minister. He will have known what Putin's Russia was up to, I hope, being a Liberal Democrat. And so I felt that was such a totally disproportionate, headline-grabbing intervention that was one of those moments where the debate also got poisoned.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, I had misgivings about the way the council handled Rustlings Road. I think there was fair criticism to be made. I think comparing a peaceful and lawful act of highway maintenance to the way that Putin ruled Russia was totally unhelpful.
Okay.
And the other aspect of that was, the other aspect of that was, I don't think there was a good relationship between the Liberal Democrat councillors in the southwest of the city and the Liberal Democrat MP in the southwest of the city and the Labour-run council.
Right.
I guess mistrust on, they were the two parties that exchanged power several times. Ironically, despite having exchanged majority control of the council, both had supported Streets Ahead. But for example, over Rustlings Road, I know that I think even some Liberal Democrat councillors took up opportunities to go out and do tree walks with council officers and talk to residents about it. But I don't think that took place on Rustlings Road. I think what I believe, and it would be up to them to correct me on this, I believe what happened was they didn't do that sort of community engagement. It flared up and they got behind the petition. So rather than in other places, and councillors of all parties in other places went out and did sort of community engagement work to try and resolve concerns, other politicians were not doing that and then jumping on the bandwagon. Nick Clegg being an example of that, in a way he intervened in that after the event rather than engaging in it before the event.
Okay.
But obviously I might be seen as making a party political point in that, so yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you for giving us your perspective on that, which is important perspective. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about is what discussions you recall, including discussions in the Labour group, about the decision to seek an injunction against protesters in June 2017, whether you had any views on that decision, and whether you have any views on the impact of that step on the dispute.
Well, I can tell you very clearly, I recall very clearly, what we were told our responsibility was with regards to that decision. And this was subsequently reiterated to me when I became Cabinet Member by Gillian Duckworth as Director of Legal and Governance. The advice that Gillian Duckworth gave us was that it was a decision for council officers and for legal officers of the council as to whether the council ought to seek an injunction in order for the council to carry out its duties and for the council to implement the policy that we as councillors had set. So she was very clear to us in guiding us in her view that it wasn't correct for us to decide about whether to apply for the injunction.
Okay. Did you have any view about that, the decision? You say it was not a decision you could have had any influence over, but did you have any view about it? And do you have any view about the impact that then had on the way the dispute unfolded?
So we did have a discussion as it happened. We did have a non-binding discussion for the sake of discussion.
Yes.
At Labour Group about the prospect of an injunction, which had begun to be bandied around as a solution to the impasse. So my understanding was that the concern was the campaigners had, and I think this related to, so as I keep saying, we have these processes of tree forums, independent tree panel, petitions to full council, and as there were those who felt that the council didn't shift enough, the campaign sort of radicalised towards direct action and direct action disrupting the tree works, and this was of great concern within the council with regards to, again, the safety of the public and the safety of workers. I would say on that, I think there were those out there at the time who felt that was whenever the safety of workers and safety of public was invoked, there were those who felt that was rhetoric. But that wasn't, in my experience, and engaging with people such as Brian Lodge or Julie Dorr or anybody, I think that it was sincerely held. Mm-hmm. As Labour councillors, we have a close relationship with trade unions, for example. So I was a GMB councillor, so I went every month to meet frontline council workers, including frontline AME workers, and talk to them about their experiences. And there was genuine concern and fear that I think amongst the workforce that one accident could get very serious when you've got a man up a tree with a chainsaw. Yeah. It only takes one accident. So when I think the injunction came out of, and the argument for the injunction that was presented to us was it would act as a deterrent, and that there were people who were willing. There were people who did not find the risk of disrupting a man using a chainsaw off-putting, but they would find the risk of going to prison off-putting. And so the argument went, if we bring an injunction in, then that will cut off the direct action and people can continue to peacefully protest up to the limit but not cross the threshold. And I think that the majority view was, at that time, was that it was a necessary evil. There was discomfort. But I think that most Labour councillors believed it would act as a deterrent and didn't envisage the injunction being relied on to get work done in the way it was.
Okay, thank you.
That might have been and I don't know whether that was naive. I think the other thing to say is as with a lot of these things, is the council is the council and those things that council is involved in. It's a vast public body. At the same time, we would be, there are many necessary evils that councillors have to deal with in terms of public policy. There are other injunctions in order to protect the public. There's, I don't know, to take a case, cases that we come across quite, people getting evicted for rent arrears and stuff like this through court. So I think it was again, there was parts of the wider community who felt that an injunction per se was an incredibly heavy-handed step. And it might be jaded, but I think for experienced councillors who, like I say, have constituents who are evicted by the council, who or whatever, who have parking fines, who have to go to the magistrate's court for littering. You know, the council does all sorts of quasi-judicial interactions, and so I think it is worth bearing in mind that whereas amongst some members of the wider community this was seen as an unusual escalation, it wasn't a totally unusual escalation within the council.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say on that?
The other thing I think that's worth bearing in mind was there was, and this is kind of related to some of the background I've already given, there was anger that the police had used the Trade Union Liaison Act, you know, which is legislation that, well, certainly in the last two elections, possibly in 2015, the Labour Party had said that we would get rid of the Thatcher-era trade union legislation. So then for the police to use anti-trade union laws was embarrassing. And so one of the motives behind the injunction was for the police, because I think our understanding was that the police had to rely on that. We didn't really understand why either. Why did the police rely on that rather than obstructing the highway? But I think the understanding we arrived at was there wasn't a positive, unless we took out an injunction, there wasn't a positive power which enabled us to carry out this work undisrupted, and so it was necessary to do that to avoid the police relying on esoteric legislation.
Yes, okay.
Such as that. So that was the other context, because at the time, when was that? November 16 was the use of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act. At the time, and this was fairly early on, November 2016 in the dispute. That was quite alarming.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes. Okay.
And again, and this is the thing. So as I've explained, we were told that actually this, in the general run of things, day-to-day decision making was taken by the cabinet member. So we set the overall policy, but then the cabinet member would decide, would be consulted by officers about how to handle something like Rustlings Road. We were then told, with regards to the injunction, that it really wasn't the preserve of elected members to make decisions like that, full stop, and it was the preserve of the council officers. So,
could I just ask you whether, in retrospect, given what you know now, you would be likely to take the same view?
I think that this is an example of where our very good and right system of lay people governing a large and complex public authority struggles. To whom would we turn for independent legal advice? I believe, tree campaigners, I suppose, would have said to us, well, we have lawyers helping us pro bono, but with the greatest of respect to them, their judicial review had been ruled to be devoid of merit. So I don't know how we would have challenged it, given what we were told. I feel, given what I know about the process, it was effectively presented to us as a fait accompli.
Yes, I understand what you're saying.
And we were consulted on, and by the cabinet member saying, well, look, I've been given this decision as a fait accompli. How does it sit with you?
Yes.
And we said, well, if this is the case, then that's what it's got to be. I don't know if it was.
Yes,
and
okay.
I suppose it's worth me saying, I'm looking forward to reading your inquiry because I hope you get to the bottom of this.
Right.
And the origins of that.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
I suppose the other thing that's worth saying is this question of, I know there's two things I wanted to say on that. Now, I don't exactly have a timeline on this, but there was an issue around the police not wanting to go out anymore. And I think the other issue around the injunction was around the police saying, unless you create this legal cover for us to continue, we feel it's unjustified. I don't know the ins and outs of that. As you know, I'm a lawyer of 6th century Roman legislation, not 21st century public law. But the other issue, I think, is I don't believe we knew. It goes far to say I am certain that we did not know the names of the individuals named in the injunction until it was published. AKA, we did not take out the injunction, and to the extent that we did, as Labour councillors, we did not do so because it was an opposition councillor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like I say,
you in the Labour group did not know that.
I don't have access to minutes of those meetings or stuff that was stored on my council computer, but to the best of my recollection, we did not know that, and that was a surprise to us when that came out.
Uh-huh.
And I think that was, I think we would have been quite concerned about that had we known.
Because?
I think because an important aspect of this entire business is trust, and it looked like a bad move. It looked like a bad play, a foul play to do that.
Right. I understand.
Again, it's certainly not comparable but I suppose that's something people point to when I say this is not like Putin's Russia. Well, they say, well, you try to lock up your political opponents. Now, of course, I don't think that is what we did. And we also live in a country with an independent judiciary which handled all matters relating to that injunction, and people got a fair trial with that. But it was certainly not good in terms of communications and building trust.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay. So thanks very much for taking us through your views on all that. It's extremely helpful. As you know, the dispute escalated through the second half of 2017 and into early 2018, and my understanding is you had some concerns about that, and I wonder if you could tell us about your concerns and who you raised them with.
Well, I mean that was an odd period. We'd had all-out elections on the council in 2016, in which I think the Labour Party did surprisingly well, especially in places affected by this. So we had lost seats to the Green Party in Broom Hill in 2014, 2015. I won my seat in Central by 41 votes in 2015, and then in 2016 we had a big swing to us in those areas, and so that sent a sort of signal which was read, I guess, by some people as this this whole business is not as, we're getting barracked in full council on a whole range of issues, by the way, and this is I think is an important point. Certainly in that period, 2015 to 2016, yes, the council was under fire on trees, but it was also on the Graves Gallery restoration, devolution, a whole range of issues. And so when those 2016 local election results and Labour comfortably held on to the council and picked up seats in areas that had been affected by this, I think it was felt that was positive feedback from the electorate. Then in June 2017, we then had it's what we call a fallow year, in terms of there was no council elections that year.
Yeah.
But we had the general election that year, in which for the first time in history, 100% of MPs in Sheffield were Labour MPs, and we got the first ever Labour MP elected to represent Rustlings Road, for example. So again, in terms of a key part of our democratic process being feedback from the electorate, the feedback was good. Now, obviously, people vote for all sorts of reasons, especially in a general election, and I think maybe that feedback was overinterpreted. In terms of that was more reflective of how people in those areas of the city were happy with Labour nationally than locally. And so I think that the part of the reason, so you had the replacement of Terry Fox with Brian Lodge in May 2016. So you had 2015 to 2016, my first year on the council, in which Terry had made an increasingly conciliatory offer to campaigners.
Yeah.
Tree forums. Actually, that didn't resolve it. Independent tree panel. I mean, I think although they're good friends, they're not opponents. The replacement was seen as, of Terry with Brian, was seen as a hardening of the position, and I think Brian was seen as a more no-nonsense approach to it, in the sense of not making further concessions and honouring the ITP and what had been agreed, but getting the programme back on track. I mean, this was a big concern, and I said at the very start, Pothole City, this was still a concern that actually we were still in this this core investment period, and not every road had been resurfaced, and people were saying to us, what's all this fuss about, why are the roads not resurfaced? And I think what went really wrong then, so Brian had a sort of a change in rhetoric. Terry was very conciliatory about it. Brian was more robust rhetoric around the fact that his constituents, and I think this is probably true, I think it's probably true that the people in Burley Ward, which is it's ex-pit villages and 20th century housing estates, it's not the Victorian boulevards of Broom Hill or Never Edge. So I think they didn't have the same issues with trees, and therefore Brian was probably entirely right in saying the people in the Park City I represent just want us to get on with the highways programme. What was then unfortunate was that toughening of rhetoric was achieved with what was seen as a complete betrayal over the ITP and the failure, and this was the cause of some real issues for local councillors. So local councillors who had been raising issues, and had asked in 2015, been asking Terry, how do we, can we have tree walks? Can we have information to share with our constituents? And eventually we've got the ITP, which was enabled us to say to people, you are going to have a formal consultation. If you trigger an investigation, you'll get a professional independent report on whether this work is necessary, and get the full details on it. And the fact that the council didn't implement what the ITP recommended, I think was a major turning point. I think if the council had implemented what the ITP said, then actually things would not have escalated further. There would have still been, there are people who believe that not a single tree should come down. Probably a small minority. Most of the people, indeed, most of the people in Stag I worked with had a sufficient interest and knowledge about arboriculture to know that that was unrealistic. But I think the average person, especially on these streets, the average person who had, voted to refer this to the ITP, got the results back and gone, okay, well, this has been double-checked by an independent panel, that's fine. When they were then told that the council wasn't following the independent panel, I think that really was a severe breakdown in relations.
Thank you very much. As towards the back end of 2017 and early 2018, as you know, matters escalated in terms of behaviour on the streets, and I wonder what concerns you had about that and who you talked to about the concerns you had around that time.
Yes, so this was also the period in which the Streets Ahead programme was coming to Meersbrook in my ward in a serious way. So in my role as a local councillor, I was again, like I say, in 2015 when I was briefly representing Sharrow, I had dealt with this as a local councillor, but again this was now happening in my patch. So I had quite a lot of correspondence with residents, with quite a lot of correspondence with the local Labour Party. I'm not sure they're of great interest, but I've dug out some of those letters and some of those councillors' reports to give to you, just to demonstrate, I thought there was two things that struck me when I was looking for councillors' reports. One was, they're interesting because they show you our best attempt to understand what was going on at the time and why it was going on. The attempt at reconciliation, and also the fact that, this issue 2016, 2017, in most parts of the city, and indeed even when it was flaring up in Meersbrook, in other parts of Gleadless Valley, the issues there were just so many other issues. We had, for example, we had a estate renewal fund regeneration policy at the same time, which was a big concern of us. So, in terms of our level of, as free part-time local councillors, it was a stretch to keep abreast of all the issues affecting every area. So we had, I guess what I'm trying to express is that it was a bit of a slow build-up, so we were aware there were issues in Meersbrook. This went away while it was referred to the ITP. The ITP report came back. There's some concern that the council wasn't planning to implement it all. And then the feeling on the ground in Meersbrook really built up. There's quite a few unhappy, apart from residents, quite a few very unhappy Labour Party members who really didn't understand why. And the other key thing with that is this issue around it being a PFI and all of that sort of stuff. So I wasn't present. There was a large confrontation in January 2018 on Meersbrook Park Road. There were also many members of the community who were going to Louise Haigh as a local MP and coming towards us as local councillors, although to be fair, I think there were people who went to Louise Haigh on the basis that they felt that, well, some of them felt that even if, with the best will in the world, me and my colleagues as local councillors wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I suppose there were also those who thought that they didn't think we did want to do anything about it, but that wasn't true. But yes, like I say, having secured the ITP and that having not been implemented, I can see why people were sceptical and why they went to Louise in that case. And there was this confrontation on Mearsbrook Park Road, of which involving the private security and protesters. Now I know that many of those protesters were local people. I think one thing there was one thing that we were told within the council at the time, that some of the people taking direct action were sort of itinerant direct action people who bust up from fracking sites and stuff like that. And that was a bit of I don't know whether that was a red herring or not. Certainly that didn't really have any effect on me, because I knew that the people in these photos, some of them indeed lived on Mearsbrook Park Road. So after that, we, on the 25th of January, had a meeting with, so I believe Kate MacDonald was on holiday, so it was me, Chris Peace as the other local councillor in Gleadless Valley, and Louise Haig had a meeting. We requested a meeting with Brian Lodge and he brought Paul Billington. I don't think Amy were there. And we raised our concerns in the strongest way. We really felt that this had escalated too far, and that the conflict that was taking part on Mearsbrook Park Road, we had I had a constituent who got in touch and they said, look, I think, they said something along the lines of, when my daughter pushes her pushchair with her daughter up and down Mearsbrook Park Road, it's a nightmare. Those trees need to come down. But when my disabled son looks out the window and sees what's going on his street, I think it's not worth this confrontation. And that was the sort of, it was distressing, not just if you were disabled, it was distressing for all residents to look out the window and see this happen, and it was really a change in tone. So we went on the 25th and raised our concerns. And I don't think we were... This email's already in the tree archive, by the way, but I'll also provide it you to flag it up. We were then very unhappy that we felt that the response from... now this is blacked out, but I don't see why it should be. We got a response from Paul Billington summarising the meeting in a way that we were very unhappy with. We felt that it was it was not the same tone that we had expressed our concerns. And so me and Chris sent a subsequent email that day saying that. To I think to Brian and Paul, and I think copying in Julie, that we were unhappy that yes, they had met with us, but clearly by their email summarising the meeting, they hadn't listened to us. And so because of this, I think that day or the next day, we went and had I think probably to Julie's diary secretary, you'd probably say we went and ambushed Julie.
Julie Dorr, you're talking
Julie
about.
Dorr. We went and said, is Julie available? And her diary secretary said, no, she's very busy, she is the leader of council. And we said, okay, well, we'll just sit here, and when she isn't busy, we'll have a word with her, because it really is that important.
Mm.
And so we had an informal meeting with Julie in which me and Chris again expressed our concerns in the strongest terms. That look, this is what people are saying on the ground, that it is, you know, that the residents of Middlesbrough Park Road, those who are sympathetic to the programme have lost their sympathy, having seen what's gone on. B, those who are in conflict with the private security are putting, you know, are at risk and putting the others at risk. And I guess it's that point which is which I've already made, which is in terms of risk assessment, yes, you might have got everything in place, but all it takes is for one slip in such a tense situation. And I think this happened when the barriers went down and there was a physical altercation. You know, all it takes is for one slip and somebody to get very seriously, and then it's escalated beyond control. And so we said this to Julian. We said, you know, do you know that in your name as leader of the council, your power is delegated to the cabinet member overseeing the officers, that this is what's going on in, you know, you've got a private militia on the streets of Middlesbrough enforcing this against the wills of local residents. This cannot be the way to do this. And I don't recall what she said, to be honest. But what I do recall is that within weeks they had brought about the pause.
Right.
So I don't know. I can't speak for Julie or for anybody else. But I do think that the escalation in Middlesbrough was it was a shock, and that was a shock which helped inform the need for a pause and a rethink.
Okay, thank you very much. Were there other factors you think that contributed to the announcement or the decision on the pause in March 2018? Well,
there's a bunch of issues which I don't know the ins and outs of, because I wasn't a decision maker. But I understand that there was a bunch of issues relating to Amy and relating to Amy's willingness to offer a pause. I think Julie said to us as Labour councillors at the time, and this had previously happened, there was a previous pause in which Amy had clawed back money from the council for the council having delayed Amy's programme. So Julie explained to us that the council was to some extent waiting for Amy to instigate the pause at no cost to the council. And there was a fear that if the council or councillors announced a pause, then we would lose money through contract penalties. As I say, I don't know the ins and outs of that. My editorial comment would be that that's a great example. Whereas I don't know if you're going to find if you find out the ins and outs of it, that might be one way or the other. But regardless of that, that was the atmosphere in which councillors, elected members, took decisions. Was that we, because it had been structured as a PFI, and because we weren't contract lawyers, it was, you know, there was great concern about, well, if we do this, what are the consequences?
Yes.
And when we were told, well, if you take this decision, we'll have to pay for it, that makes you, at a time of austerity and when most of our time is spent on the budget, that was of great concern.
So who was it who was telling you that?
I believe it was Julie.
Okay.
Without I think, from my recollection and from looking at the notes of this meeting, I think Brian and Paul Billington's line at that time was, look, we've just got to carry on. We went, and it will eventually, we'll get these trees down and we can all move on, forget about this. Julie said, no, look, we can't pause it. We can't call for a pause because of this, but Amy could call a pause, and maybe we're hoping for that. I don't know whether Brian and Paul were actually involved in that and holding the line, as it were, to us, while behind the scenes trying to get it all fixed. I don't know that, but Julie was more candid with us than Brian was about that. Maybe rightly or maybe wrongly, or I don't know. So, yes, I think that was our understanding at the time, which was, it was the ITP, wasn't it? So there was this sum of money that was put forward as this was how much the ITP cost.
Yes.
In terms of,
that's what you were referring to, where you said the earlier delay had led to. Yes.
It was the ITP.
That's my understanding of. Yes.
Yeah. So I think in the winter of 2017-2018, the feeling was, both in terms of fiscal prudence, but also in terms of how it looks, we can't fork out hundreds of thousands of pounds to Amy for another pause, unless, and I think maybe unless it was actually going to work. Right. I think maybe that's the other thing is obviously that, I guess the reason Amy offered up a pause was because it was felt by March 2018 that actually this position of one more push, another week, and we'll get it done, just didn't transpire.
Right.
They spent weeks and weeks and weeks on Maysbrook Park Road,
right, and
didn't get done what they expected to get done. And they were overly optimistic about, as they were the entire way through, the injunction will stop people from taking direct action, and that will enable us to complete the work.
Yeah.
Well, that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
And so it had reached a stalemate in terms of policy implementation, and it had reached a sort of political opening where the level of hostilities and the increase in risks to the public and to workers was then felt, I think, was then alarming enough for there to be a change in approach.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. After the local elections in May 2018, you were appointed as the cabinet member responsible. I wonder if you could tell us how that came about, what discussions you had about the role before accepting it, on accepting it. Well,
the Labour group had a system where you, ahead of a coming election, you had an expression of interest form, and you expressed an interest in what you wanted to do on the council. And I had been a cabinet assistant, so sort of for sake of precision, it's a sort of non-statutory supporting role to a cabinet member, so it's the cabinet member that makes the decisions, but you can sit in meetings and then help them and deputise for them, but you're not a legal deputy. And I'd liked bits of that and not liked bits of it. I'd just finished my Masters and was just starting my PhD, I think. Yes, I'd started my PhD in October 2017. So when it came to that spring, I put my expression of interest form and said I expressed zero interest in being a cabinet member or a cabinet assistant or having any additional responsibilities. I wish to do my PhD as my day job and focus on my constituents in council time.
Right.
I suppose it's about that was my personal circumstances. Politically, I think I wasn't thrilled, and well, I suppose this was known because I voiced it. I wasn't thrilled with how this was going, and I decided that I would rather be outside of the executive of the council
By this, you mean the street trees issue?
Yeah, the street trees.
Yes.
Yeah. I wasn't thrilled with how the street trees was going. It was causing a lot of unhappiness in my ward.
Yeah.
A lot of fraught debates in I think my branch Labour Party passed a motion in the spring of 2018. Basically, they had very mixed views. Members had very mixed views. Members had been like, we know we need investment. We kind of understand that it has to be a PFI because that's the only thing that's on offer. We like trees, but we know some trees have to come down. And by 2018, they were saying, no, it's got to stop. So I felt a bit compromised in terms of my representative role in I guess, working within the executive of council rather than ploughing a furrow in the scrutiny and in the ward. And so, I'd said this, and I suppose I didn't anticipate, and that was all premised on, I didn't anticipate a major change in policy from a council that had got to the point it did, as we've just been discussing, on Mearsbrook Park Road. But then I was approached at the election count by Julie, who said, she said, I know you've, she said something along the lines of, I know you've put in an expression of interest that you're not interested in doing anything, but if you were offered an opportunity to sort things out with regards, maybe she was directly about trees at that point, sort things out with trees, would you consider doing that? To which I think I just said yes, we need to change our policy, and if you think I'm the one to do it, then I would do that. Okay.
And then pretty quickly that was turned into a request from her to you to become the cabinet member responsible.
Exactly. So that was at the count, and then there'll have been the Labour group AGM at which she was re-elected as leader. Olivia re-elected as deputy leader, and Olivia had been elected as deputy leader the year before on a sort of reform ticket. And then so when they were putting the cabinet together, I was formally approached by Julie to say, look, I want to formally put you in. I also want to bring in Chris Peace, Gleadless Valley councillor, to take on health. I want to bring in Jim Steinke, Never Edge councillor, to take on housing. And so this is a bit of a refresh. So suddenly, you would have it was quite a big reshuffle in the Sheffield Labour group, and it was a bit of maybe a shift in the centre of gravity. Suddenly you would have two councillors for Gleadless Valley, councillor from Never Edge, Olivia from Walkley, so 4 cabinet members from areas where the tree issue had been hottest, sat around the cabinet table, deciding on the policy. So this seemed like too good an opportunity, without being too noble about it, too good an opportunity for the city for me to say, no, I'm actually too busy to change course on tree policy.
Yeah.
So I changed my mind at that point and became cabinet member.
So you were appointed to the role. I wonder if you can give us your kind of assessment of the situation when you took up the role, and just tell us who you talked to build your assessment, if you like. Yeah. So I
think it was interesting. I mean, I knew that we had to hit the ground. I had to treat it like a sort of like a campaign. I had to campaign to win the trust of people who were very mistrustful of the council, and that in order to do anything, in order to get them round the table, literally and metaphorically, we had to build that trust. And I think there was also a thing whereby within the Labour group and within the Labour Party, I would have been known as somebody on the left of the party, Corbyn supporter, who, I was a trustee of Healy City Farm as a very green charity, Groundwork as another environmental charity. Within the party and the group, I would have been known as this was maybe would have been legible as a quite significant shift. But amongst the wider public and the tree campaigners, we had to get over the fact that to them this might just seem like another Labour councillor. And I think there was an issue there at the time of well, if he's going to change course, why hasn't he spoken out on it? And I suppose it's a fair question, but there were, I believe there was 2 Labour councillors who had spoken out about their concerns. But I had always thought, and it turns out rightly, that the internal democratic processes would eventually crank into gear, and that picking internal party debates in public was detrimental. So I had kept my cards close to my chest in terms of I'd taken part in these debates in the Labour group and all of this sort of stuff, but not publicly voiced my concerns. So I sort of went into it on the basis that, like I say, it was campaigning. I had an opportunity to make a first impression and start building on that with people. Something I thought was really important. So I took up the opportunity to go on BBC Radio Sheffield.
Right.
At that point, I think every word of what we said was heavily debated.
Right.
On the Stag Facebook. They published transcripts of of the radio interviews, for example, and it was in a sort of Kremlinological sort of way. What does this mean? What does it mean that he says he's a Ruskinite environmental socialist? What does that mean? What does this mean? But the thing that I wanted to do, and a lot of people thought this was a really bad idea, was I wanted to go out and do the tree walks that we had been doing when I first got elected, and I wanted to go out and meet. And this kind of happened organically, which is that I had this idea that I wanted to go out and meet campaigners and I suppose show that I wasn't scared of them. And I got an invitation from the Abbeydale Park Rise campaigners. I hope they appreciate the irony. They did appreciate the irony at the time. They were the ones who were accused of supplying a poisoned cup of tea. So they wrote to me and said, "Do you want to come and have a cup of tea with us and talk about Abbeydale Park Rise?" And I thought, well, what? That kind of does prove the point, doesn't it? But I don't believe. Well, I didn't. Because they were never found to have done that. So I went and did that, and then suddenly they started pouring in. So I did about 8 maybe different tree walks of about an hour and a half to 3 hours each in Dore, Abbeydale, Park Rise, Mearsbrook, Neveredge, Rivelin, Hillsborough, everywhere, Western Road. So everywhere I was invited, I went out. And I had very long conversations with the campaigners to try and understand the widest sort of segment of the campaigners, because I knew, like I say, from Mearsbrook Park Road, for example, that you had the people willing to take direct action, the people campaigning but not willing to take direct action, the people who were sympathetic, the people who were not sympathetic. So I knew that there would be different, and I wanted to try and understand these different views. So that was a very intensive process. And it was quite tense. I think they felt it was quite tense. The fear was simply a PR exercise that, I don't know, I'd go out with them and then I'd say, actually, you can't work with these people, we're going to crack on with it all. But I knew that was, well, basically not going to happen. That we had to change course, and we had to find a compromise, and that's what I said. It was trying to find a way of conceptualising the fact that, like I say, you know, democratic society, we have different conflicting views, and so compromise seemed a good way of framing the exercise. And there were campaigners, and I suppose there definitely were people on our side who didn't agree with compromise, funnily enough, and just thought they were right. You know, there's definitely, you know, there was campaigners who were conviction environmentalists who felt it was the duty of the council to. I mean, you know, in fairness, like I keep saying, this was probably a minority of them, but there were campaigners who felt that it was council's duty to keep dead, decaying trees in situ for the environmental benefits. And you know, and there was others who said, well, I understand, and I understand that some of these trees need to be replaced, and I would trust the council, except for everything the council's done to date. So yes, so that was the main thing over the summer.
Can I? So that's very interesting in the basically the community engagement you did. Can I ask you as well what you did to sort of get briefed or put in the picture by officers, chief executive, head of legal, person in charge of the programme? Because I'm guessing you talked to some of those people in the early stages as well. Amy?
Yeah. It was an interesting one. So I both, you know, and I had other cabinet responsibilities, and you know, particularly bins.
Right.
When I'd become a councillor, bins had been quite a hot topic. It sort of settled down by 2018, but I was conscious that we had all these other issues, budget issues. And so I sort of commissioned sort of separate briefings on trees. It was a kind of trying to find a balance between normalising what our aim was to normalise street trees as a policy issue. You know, like I say, any given council policy issue has got supporters and detractors. We wanted to get street trees back in a position where a cabinet member and officers, well, even, you know, the cabinet member didn't need to know the names of every street where there was an issue, where council officers on the ground could work with residents to resolve it. And so it was that sort of, you know, it was, if you get what I'm saying, we were both trying to get me up to speed about this, what had become an exceptional issue, while also saying, well, we do need to normalise it again. We don't need the whole cabinet discussing trees at every cabinet, or what we call cabinet team, at every cabinet team meeting. We don't, private meeting, working out what we're going to do. We've got other major issues.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of trying to, you know, work to get a collective position by cabinet and by Labour group, as you say, trying to understand the perspective from officers. I do think, you know, one thing that, you know, some people said to me, oh, well, on your first day you should go and read the contract. And I never asked to do that. And I think in terms of normalising it, my aim was to get, well, my aim to resolve this was to get a dialogue between the campaigners and the council, with Amy as well in the mix. And so, and I thought that the process was more important than the, you know, had I read contract and found. I was quite open about this every time, by the way. It's not, people ask me every time, are you going to read a contract? And my answer in full council was, no, I'm not a contract lawyer. I've got contract lawyers who can tell me what the contract says. And what I'm going to do is just tell them what I want to do, and maybe can then go and find a way of doing it.
Right.
So I was interested in it in the sense of, tell me what is possible, tell me how to implement my policies,
right, and
what the pros and cons of it. But I don't need to. Something I said to campaigners was, we've got, if you call it peace and reconciliation, you've got the peace and then you've got the reconciliation. First thing to do is the peace. I don't need to understand everything that went on in order to achieve the peace. That can come with the reconciliation, which is what we're doing today.
Yes.
And so I was quite, I might be wrong. Having followed it quite closely, and having had some, sort of semi-privileged briefings as a Labour councillor in my time as a councillor, I came into the cabinet position not thinking it was a big conspiracy. I did not think it was a big conspiracy. I did not think that there was a secret annex to the contract with a secret plan. As it turns out, there were documents and bits of the contract which don't look great, but I'd also seen it. I'd been a councillor and seen it, say, on the bins, for example, and the bin contract negotiations. It's all malleable, isn't it? You can not put a contract provision into place if the contracting parties are in agreement and all sorts of stuff like this. So I wasn't of the mind that this was a big conspiracy.
Right.
I wasn't of the mind that sort of the people on the left of my own party had, which was, and to the left of my own party had, that the problem was it was a PFI, and the first thing you needed to do is get rid of the PFI. So I did have briefings. I went and met with, as it happens, Olivia as Cabinet Member for Finance, and with Eugene Walker as Exec Director of Resources, and asked them, can you go away and find out what's the scope of collapsing this PFI and bringing it in-house? Because I do think, as I touched on, I think there was additional frictions from it being a PFI, but the root cause was not PFI.
Right.
So I came in and some people said transparency is the root of all this problem. Some people said the PFI is the root of all this problem. But I felt the root of the crisis was the breakdown in normal dialogue between the council and its residents. And so the restoration of that normal dialogue was my aim.
Yeah. Do you remember were you struck by, or do you remember anything in particular when you talked to that group of senior officers?
Yes.
At the beginning? Do you remember anything in particular you were struck by that they said to you?
I suppose one thing I was struck by was, and I've mentioned him, and so I do feel I really owe him to sort of say this in the clearest possible terms. I found Paul Billington to be an exemplary officer to work with. So my understanding was that when so I had a sort of mixed experience as a ward councillor in working with, trying to get Paul to do what I wanted in my ward when he was working with Brian. But what I then found when I came on board was he really did believe politicians are there to make decisions and I'm there to implement them.
Right.
And so I found very quickly, because again, some people said, "Oh, well, Paul," and it was, but it was very personal. Some people said, "I think I'm not saying corporately, but certainly some campaigners, individual campaigners, said, look, you're never going to resolve this until you get Paul Billington out of the picture." And not only from a sort of trade unionist employment rights thing did I think I was ridiculous and all that, but I just I quickly found it was a complete red herring, because I'm guessing Paul had got the instruction from Brian that they were kind of taking quite a tough line, and so he was tough. But as soon as he got the message from me that we were seeking compromise and we were being constructive, I found him to be constructive. So I was very pleased with that. Very pleased with James Henderson, who was the Director of Communications, Policy, Performance. So it was unusual. This was, like I say, this was the kind of tricky balance between treating this like the crisis it was, but also normalising it. So it was very unusual for the Director of Policy, Performance and Communications to be sitting in on weekly, fortnightly briefings on such detailed issue. But I had come across James working on previous tricky issues and found him to be very good. So I asked him, look, this is the biggest comms challenge, part of your role. This is the biggest policy challenge and the biggest performance challenge of the council. Can you help? And he was very helpful, James, and they were a very good team in terms of working on the compromise and working out how we would do that. They brought in different skills. Paul, the more operational, been an operational manager and previously responsible for leisure centres and stuff, and James, for example, worked with the bishop to draw up the terms of reference and stuff, and they were both wonderful in terms of their rising to that challenge. And,
Okay.
Do you want me to say who wasn't wonderful, or?
Well, it's up to you whether you want to talk about that. I mean, it's up to you. If there's things you want to tell me, I'm all ears. But if you don't want to get into that territory, I'm not pressing you to.
Well, I suppose it's worth me saying, and I would like to say this in a way that if they're contributing to the inquiry, I hope my concerns would be allayed by them. But I think, especially looking back, I was struck by so you've got these two directors, but then the exec director and the chief executive were not involved in the day-to-day handling of the issue. Now, to some extent, again, this is a case of, well, you've got two directors, you've got two very senior people doing in any other council, a very, head of service level job. But I am struck by, given this was an issue of national media concern, the level of detachment by the exec director responsible and by the chief executive, I find it inexplicable when I look back. I met both of them semi-routinely as part of being cabinet member, and they sort of had the odd discussion with me on the lines of, oh, how's it going? Oh, it's really bad what's gone on, isn't it? And it's all going to be sorted out now, isn't it? But they were responsible from an officer side throughout that. And so I didn't get the sense they didn't feel very invested in the process of repairing damage that they had overseen.
Okay.
And I don't know why.
Okay.
And that's something I'd sort of like to know is
right.
Why they, and whether, from a wider perspective, should the chief executive of council, should the executive director have taken a closer interest at an earlier stage? Would that have happened in other councils, or was that a peculiarly Sheffield thing to go on? It's especially difficult when you've got these issues around. I also had a very, I think another person I feel has got questions to answer regarding their role is the legal team, and Steve Eccleston, with whom I remember having a briefing off him. I remember I started getting emails from him when I became cabinet member, which I felt were sort of telling me what to do. Whereas, as I say, Paul Billington would come and say, right, Councillor Dagnall. Not that he did call me Councillor Dagnall after I told him I didn't need to. But, right, Councillor Dagnall, what do you want us to do as cabinet member? Whereas I started getting emails of Steve Eccleston. So I asked for a briefing with Steve Eccleston, and he told me to... I got the sense, and again, he might explain himself as not having intended to do this, but I got the sense of a cabinet member that he was telling me to back off and that the legal stuff was not to be touched by me. As I say, we didn't have any access to independent legal advice, nor did it feel, how was it, is it appropriate? It's certainly not normal to go and get independent legal advice about your own authority that you're governing. So I had no leg to stand on when I had the head of legal and governance, Gillian Duckworth, and I had Steve Eccleston telling me, look, you can't get involved in all this legal stuff. Now, that was greatly regrettable. Because I'm not saying it was incorrect, unless, you might find that it was incorrect, but my understanding at the time was that, regrettably, they were correct. It wasn't up to me. But this meant, there's a particular case where
I have a question to ask you about this, which may illustrate the issue.
I've just got it here. So I attended Save Never Edge Trees campaign group meeting on the 26th of June.
Yes.
And midway through that meeting, so they had about 100 people in the Kenwood Hall.
Okay.
It was quite a good-natured meeting. Halfway through, they got emails, I believe, summoning them to go to Givingham court dates.
I see.
And so I was having, gone out without officers. I've been said to them, look, I was in front of 100 people being asked by several people who were due in court, how come your council that you're meant to be in charge of has just summoned me to go to court when you're standing here calling for compromise? That was very embarrassing.
Okay.
Very regrettable and very unhelpful.
So I'm going to come back to something I wanted to ask about that. But before I get there, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the mediation process, how it was initiated, the challenges you faced in establishing the mediation, and what the council's key objectives in the mediation were.
Yes. So the mediation was it was a proposal by the campaigners, actually. It was one of their core demands was an independent mediation process. And that caused consternation, I think, at this end, because of the questions of with whom is the council being mediated. It's persons unknown, as it says in the.
Right.
Stag is not a. Stag said they were umbrella sort of confederation of autonomous local tree networks without, and not like it's not like the Labour Party, it's not branches with direct debits and all this sort of stuff. So what really, and this was an interesting clash of cultures, I guess, between the Stag very much sort of an environmental movement sort of thing, and the Sheffield Council very much not, which is, our council office, Stag were like, why doesn't the council want to agree to mediation? And when I asked in the council, the answer was just, how would it work? With whom would we mediate?
Yeah.
Who would reach an agreement? Who would police that agreement? And I think there was concern that the council could go to mediation and that the other party could walk away.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why maybe this whole compromise and peace and reconciliation was delayed was it was felt amongst the council that we got a bad write-up in the press.
Right.
And that it was very easy. It was much easier for Stag and Stag supporters to go to the press and give their version of events than it was for us to. And so the concern about mediation was partly, well, if they walked away from it, they'd get to tell their side of the story and we would be the big bad council. So for those reasons, I didn't come into post thinking from day one that I wanted direct mediation with Stag. Partly because I didn't know they'd agree to it at that stage. I was interested in citizens' assemblies and other mechanisms, but my concern about that was that we'd already had the ITP and the tree forums, and we'd already tried, not especially effectively or fully, but we'd tried methods like that. So I kind of came round to the idea that actually you do have a group of people known as Stag and the council who are at loggerheads, and you do have to bring them together. And after I'd done my tree walks and started meeting with them, and I'd met with the Stag chairs and started to build up that relationship, I started to see that we could progress. So I think it was in August I wrote to them and said, right, okay, one of the things that you've told me when I've come out, I think I was fairly open with them, which is, you and your supporters have told me that you think this is really important. I'm not totally convinced, but I'm happy to do it because you've asked me to. And as a show of good faith, we will get an independent. And this was probably, I can't imagine I imagine there was quite a few members of the Labour group who were not thrilled about this for all those reasons.
Right. Okay. Good.
But,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll come back in a minute to the mediation process then and what happened. But can we just come back to the issue around decisions to continue legal proceedings, including committal proceedings, and to seek an extension of the injunction, because the council went back to the courts during the period in which you were seeking a resolution, and I'm just interested in how the decision to do that was made. Any discussions you had about the impact of those decisions, for example, on the potential impact on what you were trying to do to find a resolution, and what kind of discussions you got into. I mean, you said just a few moments ago that you were surprised to hear that you'd gone to a meeting with the public, basically, and you were surprised to learn at that meeting that various people had been served with legal papers.
Yeah.
But what else would you like to tell me about that sort of set of issues?
Well, I think that was potentially the sort of set of issues which I had, like I say, I had that meeting which I didn't think went very well with Steve Eccleston, where that was probably him explaining to me why I couldn't stop the renewal of the injunction and I couldn't stop the committal hearings. I was, and my colleagues, with whom I discussed it, Cabinet colleagues, Labour group colleagues, were we were torn, really. So you have a injunction that may or may not have been taken out for the right reasons. Stag saying it wasn't, council saying it was absolutely necessary. But you've then got, it's got the force of law, and you've got people who then breach it, knowing it is got the force of law, and they can face repercussions. So I hope it's not. I hope it's not controversial to say, but the point of direct action and protest that breaks the law is to trigger a response. That's why XR continue, or not XR, Insulate Britain and stuff continue to take action even when they know, because that's the point. And so I didn't feel that it wasn't the sort of Rustlings Road thing that you wake up at 4 a.m. and you look out your window and then you get arrested. Well, not that anyone did, but then you get arrested for going and asking what's going on. This was people who had chosen to present themselves at these demonstration sites and take direct action, knowing they had their own lawyers, they knew the potential consequences, and arguably from a tactical point of view that was the purpose of breaching the injunction, was to bring down legal proceedings, right? I don't know if that's controversial to say. I think that's a fairly standard explanation of environmental protest, but so in that sense it didn't feel like a sort of potential miscarriage of justice in that sense to me, mm-hmm. or others.
Yeah.
It wasn't people who had been raided, it was people who had done it knowing what would happen. So that was a reason why I was, and then coming with that is this this old thing of the principle of the rule of law, and again the council engaging in all sorts of quasi-judicial responsibilities and engaging with courts actually very frequently. And I think there was quite a strong feeling that it wasn't in keeping with the rule of law for the council to drop any of this as a means of getting political advantage, aka resolving this dispute. I think that was felt quite sincerely, that we would have got a warm response for dropping all the legal stuff, but it might not have been responsible government. In the same way you might get a warm response from, I was cabinet member for taking people to a magistrate's court when they dropped litter in the town centre. I would have got a very warm response off them had I intervened to get rid of their fines, but it wouldn't have been responsible. So I was quite, clearly, you are very patient, because clearly, I do think, I thought very deeply about this. What are my responsibilities in this office? And so having been informed that it was not within my purview anyway, and having reflected that I didn't think it was a sufficiently exceptional miscarriage of justice, and campaigns that we support. So, as the Labour councillors, we've got this council to commit to, the Hillsborough inquiry and the Orgreave inquiry, because we felt that those were cases in which the judicial process hadn't properly, accounted for victims. But this was different.
Right.
So that's one where, I do think that particularly the individuals involved, probably think I'm wrong on that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it was an issue to which we gave a lot of thought.
Yeah.
And tried to act in good faith with it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's come back to the mediation and then the.
Sorry.
So no, please go ahead. If there's something else you want to say.
The other thing I want to say is, I would be I'd be interested in knowing whether this is the case. So I was told that the reason. I was told that it was, it was practically impossible to let the injunction lapse and to not bring committal proceedings on the basis that we had a change in policy. And then if the compromise didn't work, if I got sacked and some other cabinet member came in, I was told that if the council had let the injunction lapse and then gone back 6 months later, the court would have looked very dimly upon it. Now, obviously that's an issue of judgment, but I'm interested in whether that was a reasonable judgment or not. But I'm pretty sure that was, Steve Eccleston and Paul Billington, having consulted Steve Eccleston, said this to me: if we don't go ahead now, we are tying our hands for the future with this.
Okay.
And we are bound to go ahead with it now.
Okay.
And I remain uncertain whether that was an accurate judgment or not.
Okay.
If they'd come to me, and I suppose it's worth saying, that potentially, certainly with the injunction, the committal proceedings being, as I say, complicated from a rule of law point of view, had I been asked, it's up to you, shall we proceed, shall we go ahead with renewing the injunction or not, I would have preferred not to.
Right, I see.
It would have been a significant concession, show of good faith for the subsequent. Stagg felt that we went into the mediation with a speaking softly and carrying a big skid stick.
Right.
And I guess we were.
Right.
They felt that if the negotiations fell through, we would get the private security militia out on the streets again and bat on our way to achieving our policy. Now that wouldn't have happened under my watch, but I can kind of see why they didn't entirely believe me when I said that, when the same organisation was going to the court and saying, no, honestly, we are going to, if this doesn't work out, we are honestly going to press on with this and use the full force of this injunction.
Yes.
So I can see why that sent out mixed messages.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. Coming back to the mediation process, could you just tell us how it panned out from your point of view? The key issues that were discussed, or issues that were ruled out of scope, and your view on the declaration, which was jointly agreed in late 2018 between the council, the campaigners, and Amy.
So, like I say, it was the mediation itself was in my mind at least, a sort of concession. That's what we've been asked for. That's one of the key things they'd said is pause the work, bring in a mediator, sort it out. We kind of I feel we jointly commissioned the mediator. I think Stagg felt slightly rushed and slightly like I say, James Henderson's department sought out potential mediators, trained mediators, and came up with a short list. Stagg brought forward a proposal for an environmental consultant who was a specialist in the environment but not in mediation, and they wanted them to mediate. Now, our mediators that we had approached, I think, basically, they said they didn't want to. Dagnall were like, well, can we split it? And they were like, well, no, that's not how professional mediation works. I found this confusing because I had had so many people ask me for professional mediation. When I agreed to do professional mediation, I was then kind of told by some stag members, well, why are you doing this?
Right.
And why do you want a professional mediator when we could have a non-professional mediator who knows a lot about the environment?
Right.
And maybe this was a different perspective, because as I've said, I wasn't persuaded that the issue was around a misunderstanding about how you manage trees. I thought the issue was a breakdown in a relationship.
Right.
So I'd come round to the idea of having a professional mediator when they were saying, well, actually, why don't we get an expert environmental person? So anyway, so there was a bit of toing and froing with that, and they had to go back to their committee and stuff. And as I say, council, very formal process, but also more fleet of foot. So yes, there was a lot of steps for me to end up cabinet member, but once I was cabinet member, I was commissioned to go and fix this problem. Whereas Stag were much more of a delegatory system, where they went back to their committee, and their committee went back to their residents, and they came up with so that was quite difficult, agreeing to the mediator. I think I also suggested that we saw a civic figure, the bishop, who would then give some institutional longevity to the process. So we bring in a mediator, I think from London in this case, who comes in for a few sessions and sorts it out, but then you have the bishop as a guarantor of the agreement, and the bishop being the Bishop of Sheffield, being around while whatever we agree was implemented, and the bishop being able to speak up for either side. If either side felt aggrieved, I thought, well, they can go to the bishop, and the bishop can raise that grievance, and neither side would want to be condemned by the bishop.
Right.
It's not a good look, I don't think.
Right.
So yes, so gratefully he did accept the suggestion, and he's, because I got the idea because the dean of the cathedral had been on a council board with me on a completely separate issue earlier in my time as a councillor, and I had, the Sheffield Cathedral is very civic minded and very aware of its civic responsibilities, and I knew Bishop Pete was as well, so I thought it would be something he was interested in. And as it happens, he was, because he was seen as the biggest, by this point it was potentially seen as like the biggest single issue in Sheffield politics, so he was interested in trying to find a resolution. So that put the sort of team in place that we'd have a bishop as a guarantor for a process, we'd have a professional mediator to iron things out, and then we'd have these sessions. What would you like me to expand?
Well, the declaration I asked about, in
Yes.
a way it speaks for itself, because the content's there for everyone to see, but is there anything you particularly want to flag or mention about the declaration?
I wonder what it's. Part of the nature of the mediation is that I suppose there is lots of stuff on the cutting room floor, which I probably ought not to get into, in the sense that it was within the mediated process.
Okay.
I think there was more ground that the council could have given, and that declaration could have gone further.
Right.
But there wasn't sufficient progress
Right.
in jointly reaching a position for that to be a agreed.
Okay.
So, for example, I think it's appropriate for me to say that me and Julie would have been willing to establish an inquiry at that point. We didn't actually agree with it at that point. As I say, I thought that it was peace and then reconciliation.
Right.
I thought that for as long as you had a dispute on the streets, it would be impossible for somebody like yourself to conduct an inquiry that got to the bottom of things. But we would have conceded that had we felt that the depth of the joint declaration. And I think it was ended up as a joint declaration because of these issues around the semantics of agreement. Can you agree with it? On both sides, what can be agreed? And so it was ended up as a declaration. I think there was some unhappiness. I think Stag got some backlash. The Stag leadership got some backlash for having, drawn up a peace treaty. There were those within their coalition who would have continued till the last tree, and there were those within the coalition who would and do still continue because they think that there's a conspiracy to unmask. And so I know that there was a lot of pressure on the individuals who represented Stag not to go as far as they did.
Okay.
I also think that the residents, and so this is I guess this is the thing with any campaign group, and the residents on the streets who put up Stag posters in the windows were quite happy about this getting resolved.
Yeah.
But so they had a difficult job in terms of representing the very broad swathe of public opinion they represented, and representing people who were willing to go to prison for the cause in negotiating with us. But I think we could have got more out of that process. I also think it did what it needed to do. Funnily enough, after we'd done joint declaration, at the next meeting, both parties and the bishop kind of agreed that we didn't need any more sessions with the mediator, which I thought was quite nice, really, for one of a better word.
Success measure in a way.
Yeah. Having been told that the only way it would work would be with an independent mediator, when we actually got into it turned out we didn't. And the other thing that started happening was, and as I've kind of alluded to, this had happened in 2015, right? But in a less organised way. The early stages of a treaty programme, officers had gone and sat down with a spreadsheet and gone through it with interested parties, but we started getting that going again. So lower ranking officers meeting up with members of Stag to talk it through. There had been a period where sort of the director or the head of service did all of the campaigner-facing communication because it was felt that they would get hostility and otherwise. But we started normalising it in that sense. We could that meet I don't know when it was, January 19. No, the meeting after we'd finished the mediation process started to commission side projects. One of which was the development of a new tree strategy. The other was Amy going and working out a sort of comms relay system around letting residents know. So that was all very positive outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've covered an enormous amount of ground. I'm extremely grateful to you for your insight and everything you've told us.
Very happy to help.
I've got two sort of final broader questions, and then chance for you to say anything else you'd like to tell us. But just in summary, why do you think, from what you know now, the dispute arose in the first place, and why was it possible to resolve it in 2018 when it hadn't been previously? That's my first sort of broader standing back question. And the other, important question, I think, is whether you've got any advice or suggestions on how the risks of similar problems re-emerging in future can be minimised.
So, So there is a sense in which I would, to quote a phrase of our Prime Minister, dispute the premise of your first question. I don't know whether it was irresolvable. I mean, I know it historically was irresolvable, but I don't know whether it was theoretically irresolvable in 2015.
No, sorry, to clarify my meaning, I suppose...
It wasn't resolved.
Why it wasn't resolved?
That's
what I...
Right.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, sorry, I'm...
Yeah, no, you're right, you're right.
To get all historian on you.
Yeah.
So we understand each other on that point. So why was it not, historically speaking, why was it not resolved in 2017? So I think that there were several attempts to resolve it. The first being the Tree Forum, which was a response to the demand for information. And I don't think that worked because it wasn't a comprehensive enough intervention. It kind of opened up more questions than it answered for campaigners. They then moved to the ITP, which I think was a more comprehensive intervention and could have been the key to resolving this had it been followed through and seen to be fair. I think, I've already said this in today's testimony, but I think the failure to implement the ITP for whatever reason that was a crucial turning point, at which, following that, I think it became denormalised as an issue. This stopped being a run-of-the-mill hot council issue and became quite a serious issue, and that would take deeply serious reset to put back on course. Because once residents have participated in good faith in the ITP, and that not being honoured, I don't know how you could have got them to engage further in good faith without, such a different approach as I offered. So yes. So I think, like I say, the attempts to introduce a resolution were not serious enough and not successful enough. And then once this, the crisis intensified, particularly in that winter of 2017-18, that led, that was after a year at least of thinking, as we've touched on the JR outcome, we're in the right, we're allowed to do this.
Yes.
Subsequently got the injunction and we're allowed to do this. And the feeling was, for a year, 18 months, is if we press on, we can get to the end of this. And that winter of 2017-18, it became clear that wasn't the case, and that the level of risk to everybody concerned was just too high for it to be responsible to press on. Which is why, which is what led. The pause was crucial. The not being seen to be going out and doing work. And there were quite a few crises in the talks process. As I say, like the committal stuff at the Never Save Never Edge Trees, but there was also, days where Amy would go out to cut down a diseased tree or a tree that had been blown down and didn't communicate it clearly enough, and Stag felt we were secretly going out and cutting trees, or Stag members did, and all that sort of stuff. So that pause was important, even if it was hard to implement. And as I say, I think that from what I was told, the politicians felt they had their hands tied regarding the PFI and Amy up until Amy offering to do a pause and Amy offering to do a rethink in 2018. And from what I was told, is the politicians felt that was not. Well, while that might be theoretically possible previously, it would have been hugely costly to the council and therefore irresponsible. And so when Amy turned around in 2018 and said, no, actually, you know what, it is our contract, we do have to sustain some losses to get this back on track, that was a big change. So yes. So they could have done that earlier, and I think that, so in terms of similar problems re-emerging in the future, you know, as I say, with the sort of the depth of these interventions, had their community engagement been gold standard in 2015, when I first became a councillor, had they been proactively going out on the streets, and they did a bit of this, I'm not saying they didn't, I do think from my recollection they had some difficulty in staff retention in the community engagement team, so there weren't, you know, they didn't have people who were particularly confident doing it, especially when it got heated, and there was a whole period in which Amy froze the community engagement process because they felt that they were getting too much heat from going out. But I think that was a serious failing. The lack of anticipation of the need for such community engagement, and then the retreat from community engagement when it got difficult rather than leaning into it. So if I was doing this in the future, commissioning this in the future, I would, you know, have a really gold standard community engagement approach, recognising that street scene, to use quite an ugly but useful council-ism, street scene is immediate to people, and people feel very, very strongly about their immediate environment and control over the environment, and people feel very deeply if they lose control over their immediate environment. So I think understanding that is key. I think having the flexibility. Now I don't know whether this was true, but so I'm not happy about, you know, massively long-term contracts being signed that bind the hands of subsequently elected politicians. As I say, I was, and some, you know, proud Sheffielders would say this was my own fault for growing up in Manchester, but I wasn't living in Sheffield when this contract was negotiated. It's not, you know. But the fact is that I was, you know, in 2018 I was dealing with the consequences of something that had been negotiated while I was still at school,
right,
by a Lib Dem council and a Labour government. That was then signed off by a Labour council and a Lib Dem Tory government. You know, it spans, and so much can change in that time.
Yes.
And the idea that, well, in 2008 when we put out to tender, we had this plan that we had to replace this many trees, that was never going to survive contact with the trees or the streets
right.
or any of it,
right.
you know. And so I think the inflexibility of the way that the mindset of the programme implementation was a problem.
Right.
And I'm not saying that there was an essential problem with the programme per se. Personally, I feel that was always a red herring.
Yes, I understand.
That the idea that this was an anti-tree contract, I felt was a red herring, partly because you can always change the contract, but it was the lack of willingness to reflect and to revise this iteratively in terms of community engagement. So that was a problem. It was a problem, again, how to resolve this in the future. In the very long term, it was a problem that Sheffield's roads had got so bad, and that Sheffield's tree stocks had got so bad because of council cuts in the 90s, you know, when the city's economy melted down in the 90s, knock-on effects to council budgets, council slashed highways in order to protect social services, and our roads just got worse and worse until we were so-called pothole city. And that, that was, again, this is, as with many aspects of this, that was good faith by the politicians at the time that led to long-term, massive, long-term consequences, that the city had to sign over its entire highway budget and its entire highways programme to a private company and a PFI in order to maintain its basic highway service. I think that was a very bad position for Sheffield to have got into. And as with government cuts, full stop, this notion of back office cuts and all these sort of stuff, it generates costs in the long term. And the nature of this, the extremity of this massive PFI contract to fulfil a basic statutory duty of the council was not a good place to be in. Again, the problem, I don't think, was the PFI, but the PFI created a culture in which it was very bad. On that, I think, and again, I don't know how you want councillors to be ordinary people. You don't want them. There was some, and these are the sort of things that wound up councillors a bit, was people coming to full council and saying, well, how can you be cabinet member for the environment if you've not got a PhD in environment? And that, and that's not how our representative democracy works. And so we're meant to get advice off professionals and then make decisions as amateurs. And I think that there is something around sort of, training, development, officer member relations in Sheffield, but more widely around the appropriate level of robustly challenging officers and the appropriate amount of advice you give. I'm not happy that I've come to you today and had to say on several occasions, this is what I was told about this and I'm not sure about it. I don't think that's a good place to be in. And I think if my predecessors and successors have been in a similar position, that explains some of the missteps. So how to better inform councillors to take responsibility is very important.
Right.
And I'm not saying councillors need more power, councillors need more responsibility to exercise the power they have.
Right.
And I think we took that. So, in my time, we apologised numerous times. As I say, that was never sort of written up in the same way that the calls for an apology were written up much more loudly than the subsequent apologies. But I think, I did try and take responsibility corporately on behalf of the council, despite, as I've explained, there being lots of differences of opinion within it. And I think that now this is a very controversial opinion in local government. I think the decision of the city to switch to a committee system is a positive step in resolving a lot of these issues. The established view in local government is that committee systems lead to inertia. In this case, I guess the idea is I wouldn't have been able to fix this under a committee system, because a lot of this was based on me going out personally and being able to say to people, I'm the cabinet member, I'm the decision maker, I promise you I'll do this, and then doing it. So that was important in this case. But I guess the point is we wouldn't have I don't think we would have got into as deep a hole. I don't think the pressure on individuals would have been as much had a team of councillors been taking the executive decisions rather than individual cabinet members, an individual leader. I think sharing that burden of executive responsibility is healthier, especially when you've got part-time amateur councillors. And I think that, as I've said, this contract was devised by multiple different political parties in multiple different configurations in national and local government. I think that continuity, that if the Lib Dems who had negotiated the contract, Lib Dem councillors literally who had negotiated the contract in 2008, had been on an executive committee in 2014, 2015, 2016, and some of them very knowledgeable about having been, they would have been able to say to the officers, now hang on, when I was committee chair, you told us this.
Right.
Whereas because the Lib Dems lost control and Labour got in, the Labour councillors if they had been there at all, and obviously, like I say, I hadn't been there at all, the Labour councillors had to go off for briefings they'd been given as opposition councillors. So this exchange of one majority for another majority, like, disrupted the institutional memory of councillors, and disadvantaged elected members against officers. It made it a lot easier for officers to say you can't do that, a lot harder for councillors to say yes, but you did say we could do this at the time. So I think that's one of the things a committee system would also have fixed about this problem, which is that a whole range of councillors would have have oversight of the executive powers. Now, when they set up the cabinet system, in Local Government Act 2000 or whatever it was, they set up a scrutiny system to counterbalance the executive. And I think there are numerous examples around the country. The Alexis J report, I believe, also highlighted the failure of scrutiny in Rotherham.
Yes.
With their, in a sense, much more serious failings there.
Yes.
Scrutiny doesn't. Local government scrutiny is not. There's very good practice, patches of good practice by good councillors and good officers, but it doesn't work as a system. It's not equipped to hold the executive to account, frankly.
Yeah.
And Clive Betts, as a local MP, but as the chair of the committee in Parliament, I don't know what it was called what it's called now. Dulux, is it? Department of Levelling Up and Community.
Oh, the department, yes. It's hard to keep track of all the names.
Yeah, anyway, whatever it is, Clive Betts did a very good report on scrutiny where he said, look, this is how we've improved select committees in Parliament,
right.
And now they're working really well because they have, the White report means that they've got cross-party elections of your committee chairs. You can poke your own government in the eye without your government whips then removing you. That doesn't happen in local government.
Yeah.
If it's much tighter collective decision making in a sense within the groups, and then, and if you then poke your administration in the eye, you could get removed as a scrutiny chair, and that's a inherent problem with it.
Yeah.
So I think as Clive Betts' report sets out, if you implemented Clive Betts' report, basically scrutiny would probably overnight get some teeth.
Yes.
And your scrutiny committee on this council might have been able to get some of the stuff out that actually campaigners using the Freedom of Information Act basically got more information out of the council than the council's own scrutiny committee.
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
Mr. Dagnall, I'm conscious we've taken a lot of your time,
Well,
and
yeah.
my colleagues as well. But are there any
Happy to,
final
yeah.
points you
Sure.
want to make? I don't want to. I want to make sure we hear everything that you want to say, but
I don't know. I feel, we've spoken for a very long time, and we've obviously talked through the difficulties.
yeah,
I suppose my overwhelming thing I want to communicate in summing up my perspective on it is that we've actually reached a better place,
right,
and that is exemplified by us being here today and having an openly, publicly broadcast discussion about this. And so, perhaps controversially, I might say, despite all these the death of democracy in Sheffield headlines that were flying around, in a funny way, democracy actually worked in a very painful and staggered way. But we ended up with a crisis which I think could have resulted in serious injury or, manslaughter in the level of danger involved in cutting down a tree with a chainsaw, and we didn't. We avoided that,
right,
and I think that's because actually there were checks and balances, and the citizens who used the powers under all sorts of acts and used their petitions, and councillors who eventually, and the council did take responsibility in 2018 and said, right, we need to change course, let's change course. That actually has led, that actually avoided worst case.
yeah.
and has meant we're in this position where, having achieved peace and having this, this fantastic fact that the city's street trees are now co-managed by former enemy campaigners and council Amy workers, it's a good place we've ended up at. But I'm looking forward to learning from yourself and your colleagues why what went wrong.
Okay. Well, thanks for your last point, and thanks for making that point. I think it's an important point, and we'll reflect on it carefully, as we will on everything you've told us. It's been really, really helpful session. Clearly you've done lots of preparation. I really appreciate that. Please do let us have any papers you're willing to let us have. And I think now, with your agreement, we can close this session, Charles.